there is a car that almost nobody talks about anymore. A car that was beautiful, genuinely fast, and ahead of its time. A car that journalists in 1966 immediately called a poor man's E-Type. And that car, the Triumph GT6, was discontinued after just 7 years, quietly, without ceremony, without a replacement, without so much as a proper farewell. But here is what makes this story different. The GT6 didn't fail because it was bad. It failed because it was almost perfect. And in the car industry, in any industry, being almost perfect at the wrong moment, with the wrong people controlling your future, can be more fatal than outright mediocrity. Today, we are going inside the real story, not the brochure version, the backstage version. The engineering gamble that created it, the suspension scandal that haunted it, the corporate merger that sealed its fate, and the Japanese car that arrived like a cold wind and blew out the last candle. If you were alive in the 1960s and 70s, you lived through this era. You may have seen these cars on the road. By the end of this video, you will understand something that the men who killed the GT6 never did. They were sitting on something genuinely special, and they walked away from it for reasons that had nothing to do with whether the car deserved to survive. So let us go back to Coventry, to a small, proud British car company that had already punched well above its weight and was about to try it one more time. The GT6 story starts not with the GT6 at all, but with its smaller sibling, the Triumph Spitfire. The Spitfire launched in 1962 as a cheap, cheerful open-top roadster designed by the Italian stylist Giovanni Michelotti. Pretty, simple, affordable. It sold well. People loved it. But there was a problem. When Michelotti gave the Spitfire a proper fastback GT roof, a closed coupe body that made it look genuinely elegant, the four-cylinder engine underneath couldn't carry the extra weight. The car looked expensive and performed like it was embarrassed about it. Triumph had a prototype on a shelf since 1963, Michelotti's fastback, Spitfire, internally called the Spitfire GT. Beautiful shape, wrong engine. Project shelved. And then, something happened at a racetrack in northern France that changed everything. Le Mans. In 1964 and again in 1965, Triumph sent modified Spitfires wearing fiberglass copies of that fastback roof to compete in the 24 hours. In 1965, one of those cars took first in class. Triumph's own marketing later claimed the GT6 was born from those Le Mans races. Their adverts actually read "Bred at Le Mans to put you safely ahead," but that was pure spin. The truth was the opposite. The fastback roof on the racers had been molded from the GT6 prototype. The road car shape came first. The racing car borrowed it, not the other way around. But the racing program did something crucial regardless. It proved the concept worked. And now, Triumph had found the engine to make the road car real. That engine was the 2-liter inline-six from the Triumph Vitesse. Compact enough just barely to fit inside the Spitfire's engine bay, requiring a redesigned cooling system and a prominent bonnet bulge. But when it fitted, everything changed. The car that debuted at the 1966 Earl's Court Motor Show in London was something genuinely new. Triumph dropped the Spitfire name entirely. They called it the GT6 Grand Touring, 6-cylinder, walnut dashboard, carpeted interior, wind-down windows, lift-up rear hatch, 106 miles per hour. 0 to 60 in under 12 seconds. Road testers were immediately impressed. The 6-cylinder engine was smooth, characterful, and flexible in a way that the MGB GT's 4-cylinder unit simply was not. The exhaust note alone turned heads, and the looks were something else entirely. Compact, just over 12 feet long, but proportioned with an elegance that cars costing 3 times as much struggled to match. Journalists reached for the same comparison again and again. A Jaguar E-Type, shrunk to 2/3 scale, built in Coventry, sold at a fraction of the price. It should have been a runaway success. By every measure, a sports car buyer of that era would use character, refinement, value, style. The GT6 had a serious case. But there was something underneath that car, that the marketing department wasn't advertising. An inheritance from the Spitfire, from the old Herald Saloon, a rear suspension design that had been compromised from the beginning. And at the limit, in the wrong moment, it would bite you hard. The GT6 used a swing-axle rear suspension, copied from the Spitfire, which had copied it from the Herald. On the Herald, a modest family car, it was tolerated. On the Spitfire, it was criticized but manageable. On the GT6 heavier nose, more power, over 100 miles per hour, available, it was a genuine hazard. Lift off the throttle mid-corner, and the rear geometry changed dramatically. The outside wheel tucked under the car. The tail snapped outward. Sudden, sharp oversteer that could catch an unsuspecting driver completely off guard. Contemporary road testers in America knew it. And Ralph Nader's very public campaign against the Chevrolet Corvair, which used a similar swing-axle arrangement, had already made American consumers deeply suspicious of exactly this type of rear suspension. Triumph's biggest market was the United States. Without healthy American sales, the GT6's economics collapsed. The American dealers raised the alarm loud enough to be heard in Coventry. Triumph's response came with the 1968 model year, the Mark II, sold in America as the GT6 Plus. The swing axles were replaced with reversed lower wishbones and Rotoflex rubber coupling drive shafts, a genuinely sophisticated solution that transformed the car's behavior at the limit. The engine gained a new cylinder head and camshaft, lifting power from 95 to 104 brake horsepower. The result was a genuinely better car. Road testers agreed the handling was now composed and predictable. One publication called it, without exaggeration, an MGB beater. And they weren't wrong. But here is the brutal truth. 2 years of reports about the Mark I's tricky rear end had already left a mark on the GT6's reputation. In the car business, you rarely get a second chance to make a first impression. The Mark II fixed the problem, but it couldn't erase the memory. What should have come next was clear sailing. The engineering was sorted, the car was competitive, the reputation, given time and good sales, could have been rebuilt. Instead, the GT6 walked straight into a storm that had been building since January 1968. A storm with nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with power, politics, and corporate decisions made by people who had never sat in a GT6 and probably never would. On the 17th of January 1968, the Leyland Motor Corporation and British Motor Holdings announced their merger. The result was the British Leyland Motor Corporation overnight, the second largest vehicle manufacturing group outside the United States. On paper, this was Britain's answer to General Motors. In practice, it became one of the most spectacular industrial failures in British history. Under one roof, British Leyland now controlled Austin, Morris, MG, Triumph, Rover, Jaguar, Daimler, and dozens of factories, dozens of model lines. A product portfolio of such complexity that no management team could have rationalized it properly. British Leyland's management proved spectacularly incapable of trying. For Triumph, the merger meant one thing, above all else. Coventry was no longer in charge of its own future. Every investment decision, every model development choice, every call about which cars lived and which died, all of it now flowed upward to a boardroom, where Triumph was just one voice among many. The Mark III GT6, launched at the Turin Motor Show in October 1970, was the finest version of the car ever made. Michelotti had restyled the body again, cleaner tail, smoother front, a more modern silhouette. The suspension carried over from the Mark II. A brake servo was added. Top speed nudged up to 112 miles per hour. In Britain, sales actually rose. Enthusiasts responded. The car was, by any honest measure, everything the original had promised to be. But in America, the market the car had to crack, it was a different story. Federal emissions regulations that had been tightening since 1968 were now seriously strangling the six-cylinder engine. The compression ratio was cut to comply. Power dropped. What arrived in Britain as a more capable car arrived in American showrooms as a slower, heavier, more compromised one. Safety regulations added weight. Emissions controls, blunted the engine. The performance that gave the GT6 its reason for being was being bled away, quietly, regulation by regulation. And then in the autumn of 1969, something arrived in American showrooms that changed the entire landscape permanently. The Datsun 240Z, 0 to 60 in 7.8 seconds, 125 miles per hour, independent suspension all around, an overhead cam 2.4-liter straight six, and a price that undercut the Porsche 911 while sitting close to the Triumph TR6. Haggerty, the classic car authority, later described the 240Z as a car that changed American perceptions of Japanese manufacturing instantly and permanently. Here is the detail that really cuts. The 240Z had been designed specifically to take on Triumph. Nissan's American manager Yutaka Katayama had spent years studying what made the Triumph TR series successful in the United States. The 240Z's engine shared fundamental architecture with the Triumph 6, same iron block, same single-cam layout, nearly identical displacement. The Japanese engineers had studied their competition carefully, taken careful notes, and then built something better. Faster, more reliable, with better all-round visibility, and backed by a company with none of British Leyland's industrial chaos. The buyer's Triumph needed most the sports coupe buyers, the six-cylinder buyers, the people willing to spend real money on a properly fast, properly beautiful small GT. Those buyers saw the 240Z and made a decision, and the GT6, arriving in American dealerships neutered by regulations, couldn't fight back. The writing was now on the wall. And not even the best version of the GT6 that Triumph had ever built could read it fast enough. The end came quietly. The 30th of November, 1973, the last two GT6s rolled out of the Canley factory in Coventry. No announcement, no press release, no ceremony. The car that had been called a poor man's E-Type, that had won its class in national racing championships in America in 1969, that had been praised on both sides of the Atlantic, it simply stopped, as if it were embarrassed to make a fuss. Triumph built 40,926 GT6s across all three marques in those 7 years, 15,818 Mark Is, 12,066 Mark IIs, 13,042 Mark IIIs, not a large number by any standard, which means that every surviving GT6 today is a genuinely rare machine. And now comes the part that the men who discontinued it never saw coming, the market's verdict, the one that cannot be argued with. A clean GT6 today, and particularly a solid Mark I or Mark III, commands collector prices that would have astonished the British Leyland accountants of 1973. The cars that were deemed insufficiently profitable have become sought after, carefully restored, and driven with real pride by people who understand exactly what they are sitting in. But let us be honest about what we are really discussing, because this story is not just about a car. It is about what happens when something genuinely good gets killed by circumstances that had nothing to do with its quality. The GT6's enemies were specific and real: a swing-axle suspension inherited from a family saloon, American regulations that strangled its engine before it could reach its potential, a Japanese competitor that arrived with perfect timing, perfectly priced, and built by a company that wasn't fighting its own industrial dysfunction. And above all, the executives of British Leyland, men managing a conglomerate of nightmarish complexity, who looked at the GT6's numbers and made the coldest calculation possible: not profitable enough. Move on. They moved on. They didn't build anything better to replace it. British Leyland's next attempt at a proper sports car, the TR7, arriving in 1975, came with a 4-cylinder engine in a body that managed to be divisive without being memorable. The fastback variant, that might actually have replaced the GT6 properly, was cancelled when the Specky factory closed. The Triumph brand itself was retired in 1984. The Canley factory was demolished in 1996. The site now holds shops, a hotel, and offices. The people who made the GT6, The engineers, the designers, the men who worked out how to fit a six-cylinder engine into a sports car body that Michelotti had shaped with genuine artistry, most of them are gone. But the lesson they left behind is not. If you have ever backed something that deserved to win a product, a project, an idea, and watched it get buried anyway by timing, or by the wrong people holding the purse strings, you already understand the Triumph GT6 at a level deeper than any road test could explain. Subscribe to this channel now so you never miss one of these stories. Hit the like button, it genuinely helps other people find this content. Leave a comment below telling us what the GT6 reminds you of, or which British car from this era you think got the worst deal. Share this with a friend who loves the real history of great cars. Every share matters. There is a specific kind of failure that nobody warns you about. Not the failure of something that was always mediocre that makes a sad kind of sense, but the failure of something that got almost everything right, that fixed its own mistakes, that kept improving right to the very end, and still didn't survive. The GT6 is that story. And understanding why it matters now, decades after the last one left the factory, requires stepping back and looking at the whole arc. Triumph's engineers fixed the handling. The Mark II solved the suspension problem that the Mark I had refused to acknowledge. The Mark III refined the car to the point where it was, in Britain at least, genuinely competitive and genuinely loved. They did the work. They made the improvements. But the window had closed. American regulations had done their damage. The 240Z had redefined what buyers expected. And British Leyland, an organization so large and so internally conflicted that it could barely keep its factories running, had neither the focus nor the will to give the GT6 the American market development it needed to survive the new landscape. There is one more thing worth saying. Triumph never built another sports coupe after the GT6. Not one. The car that left Canley quietly in November 1973 was the last of its kind from that factory, from that company, from that generation of British engineers who genuinely believed they could build something beautiful and fast on a tight budget and make it work. They were right. They did make it work. And the 40,000-plus GT6s that were built, those that survived decades of British weather, of deferred maintenance, of being bought and sold by people who didn't always understand what they had, those cars are the proof. Find one at a classic car show. Stand next to one. Look at that Michelotti roofline. The proportions he got exactly right on the first draft. Listen to the six-cylinder engine at idle. Then remember that the men who discontinued it in 1973 didn't build anything better to replace it. The GT6 was nearly perfect. That is exactly why it failed when it did. And that is exactly why it is remembered the way it is now, not as a footnote, but as a genuine piece of British motoring history that deserved a longer run and a better ending. Nearly perfect is not nothing. Nearly perfect, built by people who cared, leaves a mark. And sometimes that mark outlasts everything else. If you found this story worth your time, subscribe now and join us for the next one. Like this video, share it with someone who appreciates the real history behind great cars. And drop a comment, tell us what you remember about this era, what car made an impression on you, what story you think we should tell next. We read every comment, every single one. The GT6 deserved better, but at least now here, today, it got told properly.